Alright, so today we're going to be drawing a sphere. We're going to start by drawing a circle, which if you have one of these tools, a compass, you can use that, but I know most people don't have one of those, so you can just use any round object. I'm using this large soup mug because I wanted my sphere to be pretty big, and I'm just going to trace all around the edges. Then I'm going to erase to clean it up. So the light source for this drawing is going to be coming from the top left corner. So I'm going to keep that in mind when I'm shading. So the cast shadow for our sphere, the shape of the cast shadow will be this oval shape, or what we call an ellipse. And it'll be coming out of the bottom right corner of our sphere, and it'll be attached to it and partially covered by the sphere. So I'm going to draw an ellipse that overlaps the sphere, and I'm going to erase part of it, and then I'm going to erase it and clean it up a little bit. So again, that's called the cast shadow. It's the shadow that's being cast by the object onto a surface. So the light is coming from the top left corner, but this is a completely rounded surface, so the light is curving around the surface. Our highlight, our brightest area, is going to be up in the top left over here. So we want to think about our shading needs to follow the curve of the surface, so our shading needs to be curved to match the surface. So it's going to be in this crescent moon shape. I'm going to very, very lightly draw a guideline for my shading, but here's the thing, that guideline needs to be super light because you don't want to be able to see any actual lines. So I even went in and erased it so that that guideline is very barely visible. So I'm not shading too dark yet, and I'm shading in this sort of crescent moon shape. So up towards the top of the sphere, the shading is, the shaded area is smaller, and then it gets wider as it gets further away from the light source. I'm going to clean up the edges. Alright, so now within that shaded area, I'm going to shade an even darker area in the middle of that. I'm still going to make it that crescent moon shape, so on both ends of the shadow they need to be tapered off, and then it should get wider in the middle. So it's still this crescent moon shape, and it's a darker area within that already shaded area, so there's gaps that I'm leaving on both sides. So now I'm going to start adding more light shading that's going more towards my highlight. So the brightest area is going to be that area in the top left, that's going to be left white, but as we get further away from the light, it's going to gradually get darker. This shading that I'm adding right now, I'm barely applying any pressure to the pencil at all. It's as light as I can possibly go. It's just a really light gray. So now what I'm doing is I want all these different shades of gray to look like they blend together. So I don't want it to all of a sudden have one area that's really light next to one area that's really dark. They need to look as though they're blended together, so there needs to be an area in between them. So that as we're gradually curving away from the light, it's gradually going from light gray to medium gray to dark gray. So I'm going to just keep adding more and more layers of shading. Now I'm going to my core shadow, which is that darkest part of the shadow, and I'm darkening it up even more. But notice how I'm leaving a gap all around the edge of the sphere. So that gap that I'm leaving there is called reflected light. So the light rays are hitting the surface that the object is sitting on and bouncing all around, and some of those light rays are creating this sort of halo effect because they're reflecting onto the surface of that sphere. So I'm leaving a little halo of light around the outside. So that darkest part is the core shadow, and this little halo of light is the reflected light. I don't want the reflected light to be completely white though, it still should have some shading. So I'm just adding a little bit of light shading around the area of my reflected light. And just adding more layers of shading. So at this point, I want it to look smoother, so I'm doing something I wouldn't normally do, which is I'm blending it with a Kleenex. The thing is, it's very easy to overblend. Notice how I blended that, but then I lost all of my contrast, meaning now everything kind of looks like the same shade of gray. I lost that really dark area there. So if you're going to blend with a tissue or something like that, first of all, you don't want to overblend because everything will just turn the same gray and everything will just, you know, mush together. And yeah, you'll lose all that contrast. And then after you blend, you always want to go back in, and not only do you have to go back in and add more layers of shading to your darkest areas to bring up those dark areas, but you also have to go back in because you want to maintain your highlights. You still want those light areas, so you'll have to go in and erase in some areas so that you still have areas that are white, you still have areas that are black, and that not everything is just the same shade of gray. So if you choose to use either your finger or a tissue to blend, you need to make sure you're not over blending, and you need to make sure that after you blend you still go back in and add more layers of shading to give your drawing more depth. You shouldn't be blending at the very end. So now I'm going in, and because I lost some of my highlight in the top there when I blended, so I want to go back in with the eraser to recreate that white area in the top. So I'm just adding more and more layers of shading to bring up those darker areas and to get, I want a lot of different values, so I want lots of different shades of gray. I don't want it to all be the same shade of gray. I want light grays, I want medium grays, and I want dark grays. I want the full range in there. I'm going back and I'm making my core shadow even darker just to bring up the contrast, and then adding more shading to blend, have the core shadow blend into those lighter grays so that my core shadow doesn't look just like a obvious stripe of black color. Just defining my edges a little bit. And then making sure I still have my highlight in the top left corner, so I'm going and erasing to make sure it stays white up there. Now I'm just still going and making small little adjustments. And erasing again to make sure my highlight's there. There's my cat. He wanted to say hi. And defining my edges. And he wanted to say hi again. Alright, so now we're moving on to the cast shadow, which is the shadow that's cast by the object onto the surface, and my cat really did not want to leave at this point. But the darkest part of the cast shadow is going to be the part that's nearest to the object, because that's going to be the part where the most light is being blocked. And then, as we get further away from the object, the cast shadow should gradually get lighter because we have all this reflected light spilling in from the sides, and it's going to lighten it up a bit. It shouldn't lighten up too much because we still want our cast shadow to be the darkest part of our drawing. So we only want it to get a little bit lighter as it gets further away from the object. And now I'm going to clean up the edges of my cast shadow. And just define all the edges a little bit just so it's a bit more clear. And clean it again. That's it.